And welcome. Secretary Buttigieg, I'm really pleased and honored to have you before this subcommittee to testify on the President's budget request for the Department of Transportation for fiscal year 2022. I look forward to discussing the President's vision and how this budget request, along with the American Jobs Plan, will help to improve the safety and efficiency of our transportation networks. It is a challenging time to plan ahead for DOT with a reauthorization bill on deck, an overall budget agreement outstanding, an American Jobs Plan under negotiations, the impact of COVID still wreaking havoc on transportation revenues, and highway trust fund issues. Now that we have the President's budget proposal, it's time to get to work. It's not like the condition of our transportation infrastructure is a secret. We all know that the state of good repair needs in every single mode are in the billions of dollars. Highways and bridges have a $786 billion backlog, transit $105 billion in deferred maintenance, and Amtrak needs $42 billion for the Northeast Corridor alone. And that's just the cost to address our current infrastructure deficit. That does not protect our roads, rail, and airports from rising sea levels and increasing flood risks. We must admit that resilience is not a luxury. We cannot adapt to the effects of climate change by nickeling and diming it. I agree with the Secretary that it is time for bold action. While it may be hard to come up with the revenues, it is nowhere near the hardship that we will face if we don't invest now. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Collins to pull together a bipartisan bill this year. We share the same commitment to improving safety, rebuilding our transportation infrastructure, and providing opportunities for the transportation workforce. The President's $88 billion budget request for the Department of Transportation builds on many of these same objectives and themes. The budget prioritizes safety by increasing funding for FAA Safety Office and NHTSA's vehicle safety programs, both important to address weaknesses in our certifications systems and the alarming rise in traffic fatalities. I'm glad to see that climate change initiatives are a focus across the department because resiliency needs to be a key part of any infrastructure program. I'm also glad to see that the budget continues to invest in our transportation workforce. It funds the Aviation Workforce Development Program. It provides resources to help transit systems adapt to electric vehicle fleets. It fully funds the 5th Maritime Training Vessel to educate our maritime workforce. The focus on these priorities demonstrates a commitment to addressing the workforce challenges across the transportation industry that I fully support. I see a lot of good things in this budget request, but I'm concerned about the lack of funding for Amtrak and the potential impact to the workforce. The budget request will not have enough to prevent furloughs and sustain services if we don't have additional resources through a surface reauthorization or the American Jobs Plan. The same can be said with the elimination of popular programs for airports and bridges. The Jobs Plan and surface reauthorization have the potential to deliver historic investments in infrastructure in every state. It's important to know where things stand as we start to mark up the THUD appropriations bill. If these negotiations drag on, it will be incumbent on Congress to extend the FAST Act as it expires on September 30th, as well as to make sure that Highway Trust Fund remains solvent. Secretary Buttigieg, I look forward to hearing your testimony on the budget request. Your leadership at the department is just what we need to focus on the future and the challenges ahead. Most people take transportation for granted until something goes wrong. We saw this with the Colonial Pipeline incident. We've seen it when roads get flooded or a bridge has to be shut down and people don't have a way to get home. I really think the way that you're speaking and leading on these issues is a refreshing change. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Vice Chair Collins for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Buttigieg, I'm delighted to join the chairman in welcoming you to your first hearing before our subcommittee. As part of the fiscal year 21 omnibus, we provided $87 billion for the Department of Transportation, excluding emergency funding. This funding supports our nation's infrastructure through important programs, including highway funding, build grants, now called raised grants, the Airport Improvement Program, Port Infrastructure Development Grants, and much more. As we begin our work on fiscal year 22, it is important to note that unlike previous years, there is not yet a budget agreement in place Top-line funding levels remain to be determined. The administration's fiscal year 22 request for DOT is $88 billion. Of this amount, the request includes $25.7 billion in discretionary resources, an increase of $411 million above current levels. The administration's budget request is in addition to its infrastructure plan. As described in the budget, the American Jobs Plan proposes nearly $2.3 trillion in new investment, including $621 billion for transportation and resiliency programs. Under the plan, the department would oversee for $540 billion in transportation-related investments and $7.5 billion for resiliency. This proposal, as well as the administration's fiscal year 22 budget request, would be on top of the supplemental funding provided by the CARES Act, the December COVID bill, and the American Rescue Plan. I have long supported a robust infrastructure investment in this country, and I worked hard with our former ranking member, Senator Jack Reed, to increase funding for many programs. The administration's infrastructure plan, however, represents trillions in new spending and seems to be a vehicle for major unrelated policy changes rather than an effort to modernize and rebuild our physical and digital infrastructure. That's why I've been working hard with a bipartisan group of senators to develop a proposal that does focus on the critical physical and digital infrastructure investments that our nation needs. Although I'm concerned about the overall level of spending being proposed by this administration, I want to take a moment to discuss areas of shared interest. I'm pleased to see the inclusion of the popular RAISE grant program, formerly called BILL, before that it was called TIGER, in the administration's request. I've championed this program since 2009, as well as the infra grants, which are focused on freight corridors. Our state departments of transportation rely on these two discretionary grants programs to fund much-needed improvements. These programs have been particularly helpful for Maine's rural communities, including in Litchfield, West Gardner, Stonington, Greenbush, Southport, Milo, and Bridgewater, where a build grant is funding the replacement of 5 at-risk bridges in poor condition and the rehabilitation of a compromised bridge. Additionally, I'm pleased that through another build grant, the communities of Waterville and Winslow will benefit from the replacement of a 111-year-old bridge with a modern bridge with wider lanes, shoulders, sidewalks, and bike lines. It also will eliminate the possibility of an 8-mile detour and related congestion should the current bridge fail. Rural communities face unique challenges in funding transportation infrastructure and often rely on programs like RAISE for necessary projects and improvements. According to the department's own statistics, 68% of our nation's total lane miles are in rural areas. 2/3 of rail freight originates in rural areas, and nearly half of all truck vehicle miles traveled occur on rural roads. It is therefore imperative that our rural communities remain competitive in DOT's discretionary grant programs. In addition, like the chairman, I want to note the funding that was included for the National Security Multi-Mission Vessel Program to replace California's Golden Bear training vessel. This investment delivers the 5th and final Maritime Academy ship replacement and fully funds the program that was initiated in 2018. These vessels are critical for training cadets at the Maine Maritime Academy and at the other maritime academies. I am concerned about the lag in getting them constructed and out to the academies. Finally, I'm pleased to see that the administration includes funding for the essential air service and investments to improve the safety and efficiency of our nation's airspace. The fiscal 22 request includes $3.4 billion for facilities and equipment, an increase of $395 million. Again, Mr. Secretary, I welcome you to today's hearing, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you very much, Senator Collins. For the information of members, we have a three-vote series at 3:15. We will roll right through, and Vice Chair Collins will take the gavel when I go down to vote. Mr. Secretary, please proceed with your testimony.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Schatz. Thank you, Ranking Member Collins, or Vice Chair, forgive me. And thank you to all of the members of the committee for the opportunity to join you and discuss the President's fiscal year 22 budget request for the Department of Transportation. I also want to thank the members of this committee for your strong support for the department and its programs, which help to keep the American people safe and moving every day. The Department of Transportation plays a crucial role in maintaining and upgrading the infrastructure that powers our economy and keeps us moving. Yet, as we've seen in recent months, such as with the I-40 bridge shutdown, much of our infrastructure is in a state of disrepair. In some cases, we are relying on roads, bridges, railroads, ports, and waterway infrastructure built a century ago. In addition, our transportation infrastructure and systems are not sufficiently designed to mitigate or be resilient to the impacts of climate change. If we are to grow our economy, remain competitive, and address the climate crisis, we need to take swift and bold action. At this moment of challenge and opportunity, President Biden's first fiscal year 22 budget request to Congress reflects that urgent need, as well as our values and priorities. The request includes $88 billion to support transportation priorities throughout the nation. These resources will enable the department to continue funding its current portfolio of programs while also revitalizing transit and rail and making necessary improvements to our aviation infrastructure. The President's proposal also includes a funding request for the American Jobs Plan, a once-in-a-generation investment in repairing and transforming our infrastructure, which will create millions of good-paying jobs and keep our economy moving forward for decades to come. It contains an additional $621 billion for long overdue repairs and improvements for our highways, transit systems, rail, ports, aviation, and more. The details of the President's budget request advance the vision of the American Jobs Plan and underscore our commitment to key priorities: improving safety, building economic strength, addressing the climate crisis, advancing equity, and supporting innovation. Let me share some of the highlights of this budget request when it comes to transportation. As always, promoting safety for the hundreds of millions of Americans who rely on our transportation systems is this department's North Star, and safety is embedded throughout the budget request. The President is requesting $18.5 billion for the Federal Aviation Administration, including $17.4 million to strengthen aviation safety oversight and begin addressing the requirements of the Aviation Certification, Safety, and Accountability Act. FAA will also receive $1 billion to improve the facilities that house the workforce and technology at the heart of our air traffic control system. Many of these facilities were built in the 1960s and are in dire need of replacement or repair. This funding will reduce the current backlog and help ensure our air traffic controllers have an efficient, modern workplace to carry out their mission of keeping the skies safe. The budget also includes $246 million, over a $50 million increase for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's vehicle safety programs. These programs help advance safety innovations to keep pace with the rapid development of vehicle electronics and automated driving systems. This funding will also help to mitigate carbon pollution by enforcing the highest achievable fuel economy standards and ensuring that alternative fuel vehicles are safe. With respect to transit, the President's request includes $2.5 billion for capital investment grants, a $459 million increase to accelerate existing transit projects and support new ones. These increases will help us advance cleaner vehicles while creating jobs to benefit our economy. The President's budget includes $2.7 billion for Amtrak, a 35% increase, to accelerate track renewal, renovate aging stations, refresh the existing capital fleet, and help address maintenance backlogs throughout the system, along with a $625 million for a competitive new Passenger Rail Improvement, Modernization, and Expansion Program, or PRIME grants. These investments will be modernizing passenger rail service and growing existing rail corridors throughout the country. To encourage innovative transportation projects that are tailored to fit local needs, the President's request continues $1 billion in funding for the flexible and oversubscribed RAISE grants. This popular competitive grant program provides much-needed federal funding to help localities that are working on innovative modern infrastructure projects. Lastly, I want to mention the $110 million requested for a new Thriving Communities program that will establish a new office to help communities eliminate transportation barriers and improve access to jobs, schools, and businesses, to ensure all Americans have access to fair, equitable, affordable transportation options. These are just a few of the items in the budget request, which together with the jobs plan will help keep Americans safe and moving, make the necessary investments to tackle the climate crisis, and provide the foundation for economic prosperity. So I thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but we do not currently measure the impact of new transportation projects on emissions. Are you going to engage in a rulemaking to require DOTs and MPOs to set greenhouse gas emissions performance measures?
Yes, you can't manage what you don't measure. And as you noted, we lack some of the measures that are needed for performance with regard to tailpipe emissions. And with transportation, the sector contributing the most to greenhouse gases, we need to act. So the Federal Highway Administration plans to propose a rule establishing a method for states and MPOs to measure and report on tailpipe emissions. And we're hopeful of publishing the proposed rule for comment in September of 21.
Thank you. We had this extraordinary hearing a couple of weeks ago on resiliency, especially in the context of climate change. And there was a researcher from the University of Maine who had this extraordinary technology, some of it funded by your UTC program. What we are starting to understand, though, is that UTC funds these innovative new ways to do things, and that doesn't necessarily get deployed because although there's a small grant program to kind of do the technology transfer to the various state departments of transportation, it's not enough of a financial incentive. And so I'm wondering, there's a technocratic way to ask this question, which is how do we make sure that the sort of workflow goes all the way from UTC to innovation to deployment at the DOT level. But it occurs to me that this is about building back better, but the execution is no small thing, because it is entirely possible that what Professor Dogger has developed will take 20 or 30 years to be deployed if you don't fix our system in partnership with us. So what do we do about the problem of finding all this technology and then it lays on the shelf and our state DOTs either aren't aware of it or aren't incentivized to deploy it?
Well, I want to thank you for lifting up federally funded research in Maine and so many other places where this extraordinary work happens. And I view our department's role as not only directly supporting such research, but cross-pollinating, making sure that when a good idea is being implemented, even if it's in a pilot phase or in a nascent form, that we can help that get carried over to other places. Sometimes that can be directly encoded in what we support. Other times I think it's an informal role that the department plays, helping to share knowledge and expertise, but it's a role that we look forward to embracing.
Thank you. Let me talk to you about net zero emissions in aviation. Does the FAA have a realistic plan to work with the airlines to achieve their goal of zero carbon emissions by 2050? And how much of hitting 2050 depends on sort of hopeful thinking as it relates to technological breakthroughs or massive subsidies?
So there is a lot of potential, especially around sustainable aviation fuels, but I think any of us intuitively can recognize the difference between, for example, the progress made in zero-emission cars and what's going on with aircraft. And so a lot of the opportunity is less about having a form of propulsion that doesn't burn any fuel and more about making sure the life cycle emissions of the fuels are reduced or even net zero. And I think that's a topic not only in the U.S. but in the global aviation community. As we head next year toward the ICAO convening, it's something where I think we can come together around some demanding standards and support airlines in seeking to meet them.
Yeah, I just think there's a balance to strike here between sort of magical thinking, imagining that some technology will emerge in 2035 and solve all of our problems, and it's sufficiently far into the future that we can just refer to it, hopefully, and also declaring that this is not doable and then not even trying. So I'm hoping you can strike the right balance, but also be clear-eyed about where we are. And if the airlines are essentially saying, if you over-subsidize us, we'll do whatever you want, well, that's not quite the solution set that I think we're going to want to land on. Final question. You have $110 million for thriving communities. Everybody likes thriving communities. But what do you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to spell this out a little further. The idea of thriving communities is that federal dollars can either help or hurt from the perspective of a community being connected and a community sometimes being divided by the very same pieces of infrastructure we're building. So thriving communities recognizes that there are places around the country from south to north and east to west, examples from St. Paul, Minnesota to Pittsburgh to New Orleans, where we've seen a piece of federally funded highway infrastructure, for example, literally cut a community in half. We've got a chance to do something about that. Sometimes that means capping a highway and reclaiming the land that was torn up in order to produce it. Other times it means introducing bridges over or tunnels under or transit routes around these divisions. But the most important thing is to make sure that transportation really does connect. And that's something that we're really eager to lean into as an important moral and economic responsibility of the department.
Thank you. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in December, Congress passed the Coronavirus Economic Relief for Transportation Services Act, known as the CERTS Act. It was part of the COVID relief package to provide $2 billion to support our nation's bus, motor coach, and passenger vehicle industries, a sector that had really been overlooked in previous COVID packages. Senator Jack Reed and I authored this legislation, and we were successful in getting it included in the December package. Virtually every major source of business and revenue for bus companies, including school and sports-related travel, tourism, public events, weddings, you name it, has been severely restricted or eliminated over the past 14 months. Now, I recognize that the Department of Treasury is responsible for the administration of the CERTS program, but despite the fact that the program was enacted into law over 6 months ago, not a single dollar has reached these entities that are struggling to survive. Given that DOT has provided technical expertise and guidance to Treasury on this program, would you be willing to reach out to Treasury to see if you could use the expertise with dealing with these transportation companies to expedite this relief? If they have to wait another 2 months to actually get the money, now that the portal has been set up, it's going to be a real problem. Many of them will not survive.
So we absolutely stand ready to support Treasury in this. As you know, Treasury has the lead, but we have a lot of relationships and data and expertise when it comes to the motor coach industry, and we want to deploy that in order to be helpful. We did consult with them, knowing how important this is to you, Senator Reed, and others on this committee on the way in, and we're advised that the portal is set to go live and be ready to take applications this month, and recognize, of course, that putting an application in is just one step. Of course, we'll also do everything we can to make sure that that aid is flowing as promptly and responsibly as possible.
Yeah, my hope is that we're not going to see another 2-month delay once the applications are received. That would be truly tragic for a lot of these buses that are used by lower income people, by schools. So I hope that you will help us on that. I raised in my opening statement my concern about rural communities being left behind, and my concern is prompted in part by the fact that the department has changed some of its criteria for rating applications for the build grants, or the RAISE grants as we call them now. And I'm very pleased to say that both Maine and I know Rhode Island as well were successful in all 11 rounds of build grants from 2009 to 2020. And in the case of Maine, we've received $250 million since its inception. And I want to make sure that rural states like Maine remain competitive and get a fair shake in raise going forward. So my concern is that if you're weighing factors that simply aren't relevant to rural communities, that don't exist in rural communities, that rural communities are going to be at a disadvantage in applying for these grants. Given the changes that you've made, how can you ensure that rural communities will still be treated fairly and be competitive in getting funding?
So it is certainly our intent to make sure that rural communities, no less than urban, benefit from the RAISE program. And I thank this committee and you for your support of this program. I should also note that Congress makes very clear the expectation of a 50-50 split with regard to the RAISE program, and other discretionary programs also have that. And of course, we will maintain fidelity to that congressional intent. I would also add that the original NOFO requirements from the past are intact. We've added clarifications about other things we consider important, but do not regard those as being systematically to the disadvantage of rural communities, whether we're talking about climate considerations, which of course affect every community in America, or equity considerations, which will certainly look different in different parts of the country, but in one way or another are meaningful everywhere. It certainly should not systematically be to the disadvantage of one part of the country or one scale of community or another.
Thank you.
Senator Murray.
Thank you, Chairman Schatz and Ranking Member Collins. Secretary Buttigieg, good to see you. Thank you for being here today. I just want to say I was really pleased to see the proposed levels of investment for the Department of Transportation in the President's budget, especially with regard to transit funding and the Tiger Build Raise discretionary grant program, and I certainly appreciate the renewed focus on climate change, sustainability, and equity, so thank you for that. And with that in mind, I also want to thank you and the President for allocating money in the FY22 budget for 2 Washington projects in the Capital Investment Grant Program. We've already talked about them before, the importance of these projects. It's the South King County BRT I-Line and the Pacific Avenue Route 7 BRT project. So I appreciate your work on that, but I do want to urge you and the FTA Administrator Fernandez to work with our transit agencies on the ground out there to get what we need for the grant agreement. I look forward to working with you on that.
We're certainly committed to working with you on that and delighted whenever we're able to deliver for a community through CIG.
Great. I also want to thank you and the department for the allocation of millions of dollars to support transit projects in Washington state funds from the American Rescue Plan. That money is so critical to keeping workers on the jobs and trains and buses moving on time. And I just want to join everybody in urging you to get that money out as fast as possible. Investing in our transit systems and our agencies is really important as we talk about reauthorizing the nation's service transportation programs in an infrastructure package. So I would like to ask you for your support of the Public Transit Capital Investment Relief Act. I introduced that earlier this year, and it's a bill that will provide really needed relief to public transportation agencies through the Capital Investment Grant Program by increasing the federal cost share by an additional 30% of the total project cost, and would really love to have your support on that.
Well, thank you. I look forward to reviewing how we would be able to put that into practice, and thank you for your support of transit. They've been hurting a lot with what happened to their fare box revenue and their operations. The rescue plan went a long way, but there's a lot more we can do to support our transit.
Great. I also want to bring up the issue of fish culverts, which I know is something that nobody else here probably has talked to you about, but I know that Senator Cantwell and I have been talking with you a lot about. And that is so important to Washington State, how it's important to restoring our salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest. It's important to our constituents, and I won't dwell on the details of the background, but we know that one really crucial piece of salmon recovery is this culvert repair and replacement and other fish passage and habitat restoration plans. These projects create jobs, they drive economic development, they combat the effects of climate change, and they help us meet tribal treaty obligations, which is why I believe they belong in an infrastructure package. And to that end, I recently co-sponsored the Bridge Investment Act, which would make culvert projects eligible for 2 new major bridge programs. And as you know, I'm working very closely with Senator Cantwell on this issue. And I just, for the committee, want to highlight the great work she's done in the Commerce Committee Surface Transportation title, which she's done a great job on, but it proposes to invest $4 billion in the repair and removal of fish culverts. That's really in a critical importance to our state. And by the way, it's also a bipartisan issue, so I hope that you and your team, Mr. Secretary, can take some time to review the Commerce Committee's proposal and work with us and our staffs to find a path forward on this important issue for us.
Well, thank you. I know how important it is to your region and would welcome the chance to work with you on that.
Great. And as always, thank you for all the work and time you put into to all these critical projects. I look forward to continuing conversations and appreciate your coming here today. So thank you.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today. First of all, I want to thank you. You've been so helpful in regard to the I-40 bridge. That is a very serious situation. For those of you who don't know, the I-40 bridge connecting Arkansas to Tennessee is in the middle of a serious repair, and it is truly a major hub, costing trucking about $2.4 million each day, along with just all of the, those that travel that bridge. So you've done outstanding. Your staff has been very, very helpful. We would appreciate it if you would continue, and I know you will. But also, as we look through the 22 funding request, seeing if there's anything that we can do to perhaps the federal government be of help in as we go forward. Again, that certainly was not something that Arkansas and Tennessee planned for, but like I say, we really do appreciate your help very, very much.
Well, thank you, and appreciate the communication with your team and your recognition of our team working hard, your sense of urgency, and your invitation to come along with your Arkansas and Tennessee colleagues to see it for ourselves led to a trip that was very
did. He came immediately, and again, so I do appreciate that, and that was, I think, a real boost. And as you know, it's just a classic example of your leadership. And then the state DOTs jumping in. The Coast Guard was helpful there for a while. We had the Mississippi River shut down. So, you can imagine the impact of that with trade. So, again, thank you for really setting the bar in a very, very good way. Contract Tower Program is one of FAA's most successful government industry partnerships. And as you well know, has very strong bipartisan bicameral support in Congress. As validated numerous times by the Department of Transportation's DOT Inspector General, the program continues to provide high-quality, cost-effective, and critical air traffic control services to over 250 smaller airports throughout our nation's air transportation system, including 5 in Arkansas. Given the critical importance of contract towers to rural America and smaller airports, what steps are DOT and FAA taking to work collaboratively with industry to ensure the continued success of rural airports that depend on contract towers?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. We certainly recognize the important role that these towers play in our air traffic organization and our national airspace overall, and we're committed to making sure, especially with regard to the modernization of the overall system, that every element of it is successful, whether we're talking about the biggest airports with the most directly controlled federal resources or rural airports that rely on the contract tower program, EAS, and other forms of support. And it's why you'll see in the President's request a very robust level of funding request to support FAA in this continuing work. Obviously, there's a lot going on with next generation air traffic control that will be a multi-year journey, but certainly want to make sure that the contract towers are successful in every dimension of deploying that.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As you're well aware, we are seeing an uptick of drug-impaired driving in the U.S. with marijuana legalization, not to mention the opioid crisis. Would you address your fiscal year 22 drug driving initiatives from a safety perspective and talk for a moment about the need for more research on the issue?
Well, Thank you for raising that, Senator. Alarmingly, even though there was considerably less driving than normal in 2020, our traffic safety data is showing, shockingly, there were more fatalities and crashes. And so it indicates that we've really got our work cut out for us. In fact, we saw some of the worst numbers since 2007. Part of this relates to drunk or impaired driving. Part of it relates to speeding. Part of it relates to not wearing seat belts. And of course, anytime more than one of those factors interact, it makes a crash that much more likely to be fatal. And it's why the budget request includes resources for NHTSA to continue both on the research side, making sure that we're really understanding and analyzing what the data tells us about the causes. And also on the behavior side, because we have resources to step up public communication about just how much of a life or death difference it can make to drive safely. And we'll be happy to work with you to offer more detail if that's of interest.
Good. Very good. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Schatz and Vice Chair Collins, both for this hearing and for your leadership on this committee. And Secretary Buttigieg, it is so wonderful to be with you at this important moment in the future of transportation. We have an opportunity, and I hope it's one we'll seize on a bipartisan basis, to provide robust funding for investment in America's infrastructure to make it both more competitive and more relevant to the context and the time we're in. Amtrak is, of course, my first question, and I appreciate the President's request to increase Amtrak baseline funding by 35% from FY21. We need steady annual funding to both maintain and improve our passenger rail network. I'm leading the annual Dear Colleague letter in support of that requested funding for Amtrak for FY22. The budget also requests a generational investment through the American Jobs Plan, that framework, for Amtrak needed to address the repair backlog, which is about $42 billion in the Northeast Corridor. Can you talk about how the annual budget request would work in concert with the American Jobs Plan?
Well, thank you. I often say that in this administration, I can only ever aspire to be the second biggest Amtrak enthusiast, but I'm trying to make it a close second. And as you note, there is a repair backlog, a great deal of need, and a great deal of value to be unlocked by making sure that Americans can count on the highest standard of passenger rail service. So the $4.0 billion budget request, which represents a 35% increase, we regard that as a foundation. It's an example of what we need to do, frankly, in order to be able to continue enjoy the service that we have, especially knowing what Amtrak went through with COVID. And I want to thank the Congress for rescue plan being an important part of how we kept that from leading to the furloughs and route cuts that we might have seen. But as you know, we would have to go considerably further to really deliver the kind of passenger rail service that Americans deserve. And that's why you see such high levels of funding, $85 billion envisioned in the President's jobs plan for rail overall in this country. So we'd view it as a both and, making sure that we are doing the right thing through the annual process and making sure we have a generational investment.
And if I could just briefly, Mr. Secretary, if we go ahead and make that generational investment in dealing with the backlog for state of good repair, how would that impact our annual budget going forward in terms of Amtrak's requirement?
So what we know is that repairs don't get any cheaper. And again, this is part of, and let me make sure I was clear, the 4.0 is for FRA and then 2.7 of that is envisioned for Amtrak. We can either make the right repairs now and pay for them, or we can pay more in the future. Now, as you know, unlike roads where we have a highway trust fund or airports where there's also a trust fund, there isn't that kind of multi-year mechanism when it comes to rail. But what we do envision is continuing to work with Congress to have that steady annual support and relieving some of these mounting costs of deferred maintenance that candidly was needed years ago, which is part of what the jobs plan can help address.
We first got to know each other through our shared experience in local government, and we both witnessed the ways in which the threat of climate change for vulnerable communities needs a response. My home state, the lowest mean elevation state in America, faces some real threats from rising sea level, as do a number of other states represented on this committee. I'm excited about funding for climate research, the continuation of the CLEAN program, something that I worked to extend in the 2018 FAA reauthorization. I'm interested in how some of the programs in this budget request, in particular the National Resilient Communities Challenge, will increase the capability and the capacity of local communities to build resilience in the face of climate change?
Well, as you know, and as we both experienced in local government, it really is communities that are on the front line. Of course, there are national and even international steps that need to be taken to mitigate climate change, but ultimately it comes down to a particular bridge, a particular dam, a particular neighborhood impacted by climate. And so with things like the Resilient Communities Challenge, incentives and ways to boost the innovation that's happening locally. Often communities innovating out of absolute necessity, but that would benefit from having a federal hand, both to help them pursue these innovations and to lift up and spread them to other communities that could benefit. We think this is an important part of how we can make sure that that resilience really is set up for changes in the severity and frequency of extreme weather events that are coming, no matter how good we are at responding to the climate challenge.
Two more questions, if I might, Mr. Secretary. First, a bill, very broadly bipartisan bill called Driving for Opportunity. We've talked about it before, but I commend the administration's focus on equity. This is a bill that is literally supported by the FOP, the Chamber of Commerce, Americans for Prosperity, the ACLU, and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and dozens of others. It essentially incentivizes ending the practice of suspending driver's licenses for those who cannot pay fees and fines not related to traffic safety just because they're poor. I'd be interested in your view on the issue of debt-based license suspension as a matter of economic and racial inequality in terms of access to the opportunity to drive and to be employed.
Well, one of the poverty traps that exists is the inability to access a car which is needed in order to be able to get to work, in order to be able to get out of poverty. And often these kinds of obstacles are part of that. As you mentioned, safety is one thing, and we have to make sure always that we're looking after safety. But when it's not related to safety, I do think that there's an opportunity to expand to expand the ability to access good-paying jobs, and can tell you firsthand. So often when we were working with people ready to turn around what had been potentially violent lives and get onto a better pathway forward, or when we were looking at people who were had no interaction with the criminal justice system, but were in these cycles of poverty. In both cases, very important to make sure that we tear down obstacles to being able to get to where people need, whether that's equitable access to transit or, as you say, reducing the kinds of suspensions that make it difficult for people to drive themselves.
Last question, if I could. One of the reasons to pursue bipartisan legislation around transportation is to give the department authorizations, the ability to do things that can't be accomplished under current law. Could you just briefly mention any of the reforms, things like rebranding build, creating prime, dealing with state of good repair, where the department hopes to accomplish something that cannot be accomplished under current law?
Just very briefly, I'll mention too, you spoke to Prime, which is important in addition to our funding request for Amtrak, because it can support not only Amtrak, but other passenger rail services that are so important. The authorization to do that would allow us to do so much more. I would also return to the theme of thriving communities. The authorization to make sure that federal dollars are helping where federal dollars may in the past have been harming, I think is a great way to meet the equity objectives of this administration and lift up communities as a whole.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Last Congress, we passed a bill, I think it was called the Pipes Act, which called for the creation, the establishment of an LNG Center of Excellence. And I think we asked the Department of Transportation to give us a report about the establishment of the center. It's obviously important to my state. We are the leading exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and I suspect we will be for a while. Do you know when we can expect that report, Mr. Secretary? I know you have a lot on your plate, but
I'll make sure to look into that and get back to you. We're working to keep up with a number of the authorizations and expectations in the Pipes Act, and I'll check with PHMSA to see where they stand.
yeah. How many times have you testified since you've been Secretary in Congress?
Well, I think this would be my third in the Senate, and I've got something like 3 in the House.
Yeah. Congress whines a lot, doesn't it?
I doubt it would be my place to say that, Senator.
It's because we've given up all our authority to you guys. Speaking of whining, let me talk to you a little bit about Give me your thoughts about liquefied natural gas.
Well, it certainly represents part of an all-of-the-above fuel strategy for the U.S. I don't want to venture outside my lane as the transportation secretary.
I know, but you've thought about it a
energy,
lot,
but
and you're influential. Is it part of our energy future?
well, it's certainly part of our energy present.
I'll agree with that. You think it's part of our energy future?
Well, it's not part of a zero emissions means for example, fueling light-duty vehicles, but there are a lot of applications where electrifying is certainly not in the near future. And to the extent that LNG or any kind of natural gas offers fewer emissions than diesel or some of the more carbon-intensive forms of fossil fuels, then at the very least it can be attractive as a bridge.
Well, in the last decade, the United States has reduced its CO2 emissions. And in the last decade, China, for example, which emits more CO2 than any other country in the history of ever, has increased its CO2 emissions. Why have we been going down and China's been going up?
Well, what I'll say is I certainly wouldn't want to emulate China in that regard. I hope that we can continue to drive them
Well, I
down.
didn't suggest we should, but why has China been going up? Well, forget China for a second. Why have we been going down?
Well, I'd like to think it's because of the U.S. tradition of leading the world and doing the right thing.
It's natural gas is part of it, isn't it?
I would say that's more of a how than a why, I guess, in my way of thinking, which is maybe why I missed your question. But certainly, conversions from coal or diesel to gas have had climate benefits.
So if we liquefy natural gas and we sell it to a country at a reasonable price that, say, for example, uses coal, isn't the world better off in terms of the environment?
Well, if those were the only two choices, then yes.
At what point do you think, though, realistically, in terms of available, affordable energy sources without taxpayers having to subsidize it, we're going to have other options?
Well, with regard to cars and light-duty vehicles and increasingly things like pickup trucks, that day has come. For other applications, it may be further out.
When?
Well, again, yesterday, when it comes to vehicles for other applications, I'd probably defer to the Secretary of Energy for more sophisticated insights. But of course, it depends on the industry.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about petrochemical production?
Generally?
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly part of our economy and part of how a lot of goods and materials are made.
Yeah. Do you think we ought to phase those plants out?
Well, if there are ways to produce products that create less harm, then of course we'll want to develop toward those, as industry generally does, when we find that there's a less emissions intensive or less toxic way to do something.
Do you think we'll still be exporting liquefied natural gas and it will still be a major source of energy and contributing to a cleaner environment compared to coal, for example, in 10 years?
I would want to defer to the EIA for those kinds of forecasts.
You read a lot. What do you think?
I think that the sooner the U.S. can get to zero emissions in any given industry, the better off the world and the U.S. are going to be.
Sure, I understand that, but how about in 10 years?
I don't know, Senator.
How about 20?
Again, Senator, I don't know.
What would be your preference?
My preference would be that we're able to meet our energy needs by means that don't contribute to the climate problem.
Okay. And does that to you mean no fossil fuels?
Well, certainly in terms of burning them up, unless we're talking about things like sustainable aviation fuels that hold the promise, not yet fully realized, of lower life cycle emissions. But ultimately, if we can power a given vehicle or widget or industry without setting anything on fire, that's a benefit to the climate and a benefit to the country.
Do you think it's possible, this will be my last one, Mr. Chairman, do you think it's possible with carbon capture, sequestration and utilization, it's possible to burn fossil fuels cleanly?
Well, there's a lot of promise and a lot of benefit to CCUS. I hope we wouldn't lean on it as a crutch to get us out of our obligations to take more immediate steps.
Do you think
that
we ought
know
to try
can
it?
take.
In other words, before we take our energy policy and we take our sources of energy and just throw them out the window and start over, don't you think for a fraction of the cost, we ought to try to clean up what we have now?
I think it depends how we think about the cost, right? If we're factoring in the full costs of the toxicity and the emissions of a lot of the fuels we depend on now, then apples to apples, we're already there in terms of the benefits of more renewable sources of energy that exist right here in the United States, coast to coast. The sooner we can be using those, the better off we're going to be, because we don't have a lot of time, Senator.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, great to see you again. And I want to start by commending you on a number of items in the budget. You mentioned thriving communities to address situations where federal transportation projects have actually divided communities. You and I have talked previously about what we call the highway to nowhere in West Baltimore, a highway that was started, never completed, but still divides a community in Baltimore. And please, there are also funds proposed as part of the American Jobs Plan there. I want to commend you on the Amtrak request and as well your capital investment grants increased request. You've been a mayor of South Bend, Indiana. You may have experienced a situation where local governments have really important transit projects that they want to move forward, but the state that they're in is not supportive, and therefore it becomes difficult to access the necessary funds to complete that project. We have that situation in Maryland. You visited Prince George's County. We were together when we were at the UPS hub for the distribution of vaccines. Prince George's County has about 900,000 people. They want to establish a rapid transit connection with a county to their south, Charles County, which has over 100,000 people. These two counties together have a population bigger than a couple states. And yet, it's been really difficult for them to get the state of Maryland to support their proposed transit project. Finally, the state legislature passed something this year to do it. The governor didn't sign it, but he didn't veto it. So that's the good news. As we look through the budget, I really need your help, not just today, but going forward. These kind of projects, right? It's a kind of medium-sized project. It's a transit system between two counties becoming very congested. You look at the federal transportation formulas, and as you and I have discussed previously, states have an incentive when they have a fixed number of dollars to go for highways. They get a higher federal match, much higher. The process is easier. The state just makes a decision to go, and then they can draw down those funds. Whereas for transit, you've got to go through a pretty cumbersome process to get the go-ahead, and then, as I see it, we get about, on average, in the United States today, about 54% federal match. I'm looking at what's now called the RAISE grant program. It's $1 billion. This committee has said, I think, $30 million of that should be used for planning grants. I just want to be clear that that is a floor, not a ceiling. So for counties like Prince George's and Charles County, where the state's not really stepped up in a significant way, it would be very helpful if we could work with you to make, RAISE grants can be used for planning, but if we're really looking at 30 million as if we look at it as a cap nationally, it's going to be impossible for lots of Prince George's County and Charles counties to be able to access those funds. So I want to work with you to make sure that the $730 million above the cap is also looked at by DOT for planning purposes. And beyond that, just your thoughts about how counties in this kind of situation that want to build a transit and are willing to put a good amount of money in, but don't have the ability to write the entire check, how they would go about doing it. Is it the RAISE grant Is that the way they go these days? And if that's the case, we need to do a lot better in terms of a national program.
Well, first of all, the point's well taken about support for planning, and that's especially important in order to be able to get resources out equitably to communities that may not always have the same resources, counties that may not have the same resources. More generally, with regard to supporting transit, we need to acknowledge that there's a national benefit as well to driving more successful transit uptake. There's certainly a climate benefit, a congestion benefit, and an efficiency benefit. And for all of those reasons, we, of course, work with what Congress provides, but are also eager to continue building that. And that's why the President's jobs plan calls for us to double federal support for transit. The more we can do that, our department certainly stands ready to help facilitate that, as well as through existing programs. You mentioned RAISE. I'd also point to the Capital Investment Grants Program, which has been successful, popular, and so many of these programs are, of course, getting more applications coming in than we're in a position to fund.
And not easily, but there's a clear path toward having that happen than when you've got this kind of regional transit project. So I really look forward to working with you. This is a big priority in the state of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. First, let me say how wonderful it feels to be holding the gavel, even for a very short time, once again. Senator Hoeven.
I hear you, Ranking Member Collins. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. Good to see you again. Give me your thoughts that right now there's an effort to put together a bipartisan package on infrastructure. I think the number right now is about $950 billion over 5, would range up to maybe 1.1 to 1.2 over 8. A variety of pay-fors that we talked about when I was at the White House and you were there. Focuses on pretty much traditional infrastructure, although some other things that, people feel are infrastructure. So that's a work in progress, but undoubtedly you've been briefed on it and obviously have been part of the conversations. Give me your thoughts on whether that's close to something that you think could get support from the administration and, in fact, pass.
Well, we're certainly encouraged by the conversations that continue. I'd like to believe, even if there isn't a consensus on exactly what to do and how to do it, there's a consensus that we've got to do something big, we've got to do something bold, and we've got to do something right away. And I can feel that shared sense of urgency animating these talks. I'm certainly hopeful that something could emerge that'll have the support needed in this chamber, as well as be something that the President and the administration can support and in the other chamber as well. And hope that as we continue to do this, we work on the principle that we don't want to be doing all this work just so we can stay in 13th place, but that if we come together and commit the real resources that are needed, that it can make it possible for America to continue to be in a position to lead the world.
So short version would be you're kind of on board with the work, but remaining and kind of watching to see what the final package looks like, or you're engaged in terms of
I think that's
modifying the package, or kind of, maybe just a little more detail on where you're at with it.
Yeah, so I haven't seen the latest paper on where you and some of your colleagues are converging, and of course we want to have a better feel for the composition of it, but certainly in principle, if there can be bipartisan agreement.
So it'd be fair to say if Senator Collins thinks it's okay, you think it's okay.
Well, that might not be fair to Senator Collins, but that would certainly be encouraging. Every additional senator who thinks it's okay means that it has a better shot of advancing.
Have you had a chance to look at the Move America aspect? Senator Wyden and I have introduced that. Again, it would provide bonding authority to try to get, the public-private partnerships and private dollars into the equation as well. Would generate about $223 million. And either that or there's been a revolving loan concept too, but some mechanism like that, again, to help, fund it.
I think those mechanisms have a lot of promise, and they are built, or they could build on the Build America Bureau, which is the resource we do have within the Department of Transportation, including private activity bonds. I don't think it can wholly substitute for other robust sources of federal support, but certainly believe that if we can unlock more sources of capital to build our infrastructure, we should give it a really good look.
Right, a piece of the puzzle. Yeah, Yeah, and then this one I think you'll relate to in terms of livestock hauling. We've got to have more flexibility under the hours of service rules for our livestock haulers. Latest provisions that have gone through Commerce relate to the Halls Act, a bill that I support. And again, it in essence exempts, because of loading and unloading, a 150-mile radius of where you start when you're hauling live animals and when you end up in terms of the hours of service rules, so that you have the flexibility you need both to make sure you can load and unload your animals, and of course it relates to the, the comfort and the humane treatment for hauling livestock. And I would, if that passes, which I think it will, I would ask for your support in its implementation.
We'll do everything we can to properly implement, as we always seek to do, what comes from Congress. And we recognize that, hauling live cattle, for example, is not the same thing as a truckload of printer paper, and it's important to be able to tell the difference.
Very important, and I know you understand the difference coming from Indiana. Last question I have, would you believe that one of the 25 busiest airports in the United States is in my state of North Dakota?
I would now, Senator.
One of the 25 busiest, so it's the Grand Forks Airport, and in large part it's because University of North Dakota has a fleet of more than 100 aircraft there, and the largest pilot training university in the country. So they're, in addition to the regular commercial traffic, they're constantly landing and taking off all these students, and they teach everything from fixed wing to rotary to jet to air traffic control, all these things. Like I say, a fleet of more than 100 aircraft. We need a new control tower. And so I would just ask for your support to work with FAA that we can, and this expansion project's underway.
Okay.
I'm just asking, I'm apprising you of it, why it's important, because we need pilots, and asking for your help and support with it.
Well, I learned something new today, and I'll make sure to follow up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Reed, my partner on transportation for so many years. Great to see you.
Thank you, Ranking Member, Acting Chairman, very much. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your great service. We've all been, I think, shocked by the violence occurring on commercial airplanes. Scenes of flight attendants being literally attacked. 2,500 reports of unruly passengers recently, about 20 times the average of number throughout the year. And the FAA zero tolerance policy is in place, but it ends in September. Will you work with the FAA to make it permanent?
So I would want to learn more about the relevant authorities that would be needed there, but I appreciate the opportunity to express our strong view that there is absolutely no excuse for unruly behavior, mistreatment, or abuse toward flight crews. They are there for passenger safety. They have a job to do, and we have no toleration for mistreatment of the people who keep our flying public safe.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Last week, we had the Attorney General before another subcommittee, and I posed similar questions to him. He obviously agreed with you that this is extremely dangerous behavior, unacceptable, et cetera. Has the FAA, to your knowledge, referred any cases involving physical violence to the Department of Justice for prosecution? And if not, will you commit to have a review process so that these serious incidents are in fact referred for serious prosecution?
I'll make sure to look into that.
Thank you very much. I want to join my colleague, Senator Collins, in promoting the search program. Through her leadership, I was the wing guy on the operation. We were able to get it through for the trucking industry, the busing industry, et cetera. And as you have committed, you're going to help the Treasury Department get the money out the door. It's there, but we've got to get it out, and I appreciate very much your commitment. Thank you. Raise grants, which have a long history of different names but the same basic idea. The last administration there was no priorities for transit, non-highway programs, et cetera. Will you commit to just think about and hopefully enact a notion to give transit, bike, and pedestrian projects equal consideration? My sense was they were dismissed almost ab initio, I think is the Latin word. But they're important to many communities. Would you put them in a place where they could be fairly considered?
They absolutely ought to be and will be considered consistent with statute. And I believe the statute calls for a diversity of modes to be contemplated, which makes it all the more important, not only as a matter of administration policy, but our best effort at fidelity to congressional intent to make sure we do so.
And indeed, as a former mayor, you recognize that, key transportation project could be a bike path or could be something much different than just a highway.
That's right.
And that language was not, I think, honored in actual promotion of the grants last year and before. Last year, the committee was able to provide $2 billion in extra general funding for highway formula programs, and including a $1 billion bridge rehabilitation program. And this funding made a huge difference for my state of Rhode Island. We have the worst bridges in the country, but thanks to Senator Collins and my colleagues in the committee, we've made some progress to fix them. The President's budget does not include additional general fund dollars for these investments, but I hope the committee will be able to do so so that we can, again, fund the rehabilitation program and other value programs. In this case, and looking at the President's budget, if we stick with that budget, how will we fix the bridges, which in every state in the union are, as you indicated, 100 years old, and in Rhode Island, try 200. So.
Well, this is one of the reasons why we feel it's so important that the American Jobs Act, American Jobs Plan move forward. The budget, the surface reauthorization, all of these things can help create a foundation, but we're dealing with a backlog of repairs that, again, are not going to get any cheaper, and believe we need a major generational investment to help address it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your service. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. Last Congress and this Congress, we got a bill through a committee unanimously, I think, to reauthorize the and protect the Highway Trust Fund. That went through regular order. It's there bipartisan. Why not get that across the finish line? Because the insolvency will hit that fund next summer. I know we're wrestling with anything from 2.7, 2.3, 1.7, now maybe 900 billion to 1.2. This is clearly bipartisan. What's wrong with getting it across the finish line and then coming back and looking at the rest of it?
I think we would view the investments we're trying to make in the context of the jobs plan as addressing something a little bit different from what you're talking about. We certainly know that we have a backlog of needs, a readiness to take our infrastructure to the next level in this country, and a need to find means to fund that once-in-a-generation investment. But there's another parallel conversation, I agree, about the Highway Trust Fund and different views on how to address it. From the traditional model that we've relied on, which Congress for some years now has supplemented with general fund transfers, to some other model that might make sense in the future. Respecting the pleasure of this committee and the rest of Congress and exactly how to do it, what I can tell you is our department will stand ready to deploy those funds as efficiently and promptly as possible, however they ultimately are sent our way.
I think it'd be good to at least, I think that would symbolize the fact that we're getting something that's gone through some normal process and it's bipartisan, and it wouldn't preclude doing the broader package that you're talking about. This past Monday, before I came back to D.C., I spoke to a group of truckers in Indianapolis, and they are concerned not only about what I just asked about, also about getting truck drivers to drive their units. Senator Young and I have got the Drive Safe Act, which would try to get through proper training once you're 18 years old on the pathway, so you don't lose that window of having to wait 3 years before you can get someone trained to do that job professionally. Technically put some at risk in states that have that broad geography anyway. Indiana, the crossroads of America, you go 150 miles east or west, you're triggered into needing that stipulation that you're 21 years old. Is that something we can get done?
I think it's something we can explore, provided we satisfy any safety concerns that arise with it. We know that experienced drivers are the safest drivers, but to your point, you got to begin getting experience at some point. And we're also very attuned to the concerns about potential driver shortages. I had a similar experience speaking with trucking companies and hearing a lot about this. And the president has asked me, along with Secretaries Vilsack, Raimondo, and others, to participate in a supply chain task force addressing some of the supply chain issues we face. And there's no question that making sure trucking is in good shape is a big part of that equation. So our commitment is to look for solutions that balance safety, economic need, and all of the other considerations that are affecting us, because it is a real concern.
Would it make sense to maybe phase it in, try it, maybe not go full scale across the country, but owning a trucking company myself before I got here, it is the biggest issue we contend with, along with the fact that that pathway in life, along with many other career and technical education type jobs, high demand, high wage, gets almost stigmatized against in terms of guidance that you get going through high school. So there's a lot working against that. No one's wanting to sacrifice safety, shortcut. We just like a little bit of agility and entrepreneurialism from this place when it comes to solving problems that have been around for that long. We've talked about this before, how to pay for things. Come from our great state. We believe in rainy day funds, balanced budgets, living within our means, thinking big, but paying our bills. That's the exact opposite of your new employer here. I found that out when I got here 2.5 years ago. Why don't we look there to be a little more adventuresome, entrepreneurial? The private sector's got a balance sheet that is strong. The markets show that. The balance sheet here is terrible and getting worse by the year. It's gone from 20 trillion, maybe to 30 trillion in terms of debt, and we are not savers and investors anymore. We're spenders and consumers. So why don't we tap through public-private partnerships the capital that's out there and put that to work, and allow states like Indiana and others that are savers to maybe have more access to federal dollars if they put more skin in the game?
Well, as you note, in Indiana, things were a little different. When I was mayor, we did our budget in cash. That said, of course, there are some different principles that apply to federal budgeting. I think if we can unlock private capital in a responsible way without sacrificing public policy goals or goods, we ought to. On the other hand, it's the markets above all that remind us that federal debt isn't like any other kind of debt. And I would make sure that we don't put ourselves in the position of a business that could have made a great investment but didn't, because they didn't think it was permissible to take.
It's called the new modern monetary theory. I debated Senator Sanders for about 25 minutes a month ago, and if you are bored some evening, take a peek at that and see the difference of opinion on how we can keep running these deficits and then turning it into federal debt when we don't have the willpower generally now that we had coming out of World War II, again, where we were savers and investors, not spenders and consumers. Always enjoy the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you.
Love to see the Indiana Friends spar. A couple of questions about safety. After the two crashes of the 737 MAX, the Aircraft Certification, Safety, and Accountability Act was included in the omnibus, and it reflected recommendations from numerous audits. Many of the critical provisions in that bill require funding, but the budget requests a $17 million increase for aviation safety, well below the $75 million authorized. So I want you to speak to that discrepancy, but also just this general sense that folks have regarding the FAA and the extent to which it views itself as a separate cabinet agency from the agency that you run. I am all for the independence of expert agencies, but I still think they belong under your oversight and under our oversight. And there is a sense, it may or may not be true, but there is a sense of almost impunity with which they operate, that they're not accountable, certainly to the Congress or even the Office of the Secretary. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to address that as delicately as you want.
Well, the Federal Aviation Administration is, of course, a constituent modal agency of the U.S. Department of Transportation. I know that there's been a lot of congressional interest in the FAA and an expectation that the FAA will be responsive to Congress. I also expect that the FAA will be responsive to Congress and responsive to the department whenever any oversight issues come up. With regard to the numbers, I would just want to note that in addition to $17.5 million identified specifically for improving aviation safety oversight, there's also a $57 million increase envisioned for the aviation safety organization as a whole. And recognize that, of course, funding is only part of the equation when it comes to making sure those safety imperatives are met, and that's where oversight comes in.
Yeah, I just think we need more regulatory staff. If you're going to enforce the law, you need people to do so, and you need to be able to deploy them to various places across the country. The budget requests $51 million for vehicle safety programs. You spoke a little bit with Senator Bozeman, I think, about the increase in traffic fatalities. I'm a little worried that we're focusing on vehicle safety when it seems like we've got a problem of driver behavior, right? And I'm wondering if you could speak to that particular discrepancy, but also just generally, I know you don't want to get in front of any analysis from your experts, but something is going on with traffic fatalities skyrocketing as they are. It's absolutely counterintuitive. It doesn't, at least on its face, necessarily appear to be just people on their phones, which would have been my instinct. So I just don't know what's going on, and I don't want to wait 3 years to find out what it is if you have an inkling of what you think is going on and how we can get in front of it.
Well, I hesitate to share an inkling in a Senate committee, but I will mention one thing we know is that speed is often a factor, and it may be the case that the reduced traffic as a consequence of COVID-19 led to increased opportunities for speeding, and that one of the things we're hoping to assess is whether the data bears out that hypothesis. We know that impaired driving, speeding, and failure to wear a seatbelt all seem to be among the main behaviors that drove the increase. And as you say, it's alarming. I've got the numbers here. The fatality rate for 2020 was 1.37 per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, which is up from 1.11 just the year before. And as you mentioned, vehicle safety is one thing. Then there's driver safety. And then there's system safety, right? How are the roads designed, and are they inclined to make it more or less likely that there will be a fatal crash? I think we've got to invest in all of those. And I should note that the American Jobs Plan envisions $19 billion for safety that would help improve not only the safety of those who are in the vehicle, but those who are anywhere near a vehicle, like pedestrians or bicyclists.
This wasn't in my prepared questions, but as a television watcher and also an internet user, I wonder what, you see these federal DOT funded wear your seatbelt and don't drunk drive television commercials. Are you in other channels now? Because it seems to me that anyone who's in the communications business needs to worry about the extent to which plenty of people don't watch TV anymore.
Yeah, I don't know whether it happened on its own or whether the algorithms figured out what I do for a living, but I have noticed a little more on things like Hulu that messages coming out of NHTSA are popping up. I'll look into how we are getting into other media, because I think you're absolutely right that we can't assume that the target audience, especially given that age is an important factor in the data for risk, we can't assume that the targeted audience is watching television on a television.
Thank you very much. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as I'm sure you know, the FAA has a next-generation air traffic system called NextGen. It is intended to modernize our nation's air traffic control system to provide safer, more efficient, less polluting routes, and to use arrival and departure paths that will improve airspace utilization. So every year that I've been on this committee, this subcommittee, we have appropriated another $1 billion, it seems, for FAA to implement Next Gen. So since 2007, Congress has appropriated $13 billion. So you can understand my dismay when I read a March 30th of this year report by the Office of the Inspector General that indicates that the system has not lived up to its promise. Now, part of it is that there have been COVID impacts, there has been more traffic, but nevertheless, the bottom line is not an encouraging one. And the Inspector General says we were not able to identify any clear improvement to operations overall. Instead, overall operations appear to have become less efficient, with average taxi time, departure delays, and arrival delays all increasing over this period. If NextGen worked as intended, we should see all of those trends going in the other direction. And by using performance-based navigation, we could also assist in combating climate change by promoting greater fuel savings and reduced emissions. So what's going on with NextGen? That we poured $13 billion, and this is the result?
So overhauling the entirety of the air traffic system for any country, but certainly for this country, is, of course, a massive undertaking. Congress has high expectations, I know, of next-gen implementation. So do I. That implementation is an ongoing process and not something that is simply from the before state to the after state. A change can be said. Now we're there. There are a lot of pieces coming into place, and a funding request in the president's budget to advance that. It's very important for that to happen for the efficiency reasons that you mentioned, including that climate benefit of reduced airtime, which I've seen estimates suggesting about 15% fuel savings just from more efficient routing. And we would hope to realize that, as well as some of the other efficiency gains that you were mentioning we would hope to see from a fully implemented next-gen reality. I will continue to be considering this a priority for our expectations of the FAA and do everything we can to keep Congress updated on progress being made.
That would be helpful. As you can imagine, $1 billion is a lot of money year after year after year, though it doesn't seem so in this environment anymore, but it used to be a lot of money. And to have pushed for this money year after year after year and then see such poor results is very disturbing. So I hope you will look into that. I want to go to the issue next that Senator Jack Reed raised. When I was flying back from Bangor, Maine this weekend, the two flight attendants sat down and talked to me about the mask mandate. And one of them, frankly, was frightened about what would happen if she tries to enforce the mask mandate. And the violence we have seen is horrendous and unthinkable. And I joined Senator Reed in saying that I hope people will be prosecuted for the violence that we've seen on videos. However, both of the flight attendants raised with me the issue of why is there still a mask mandate for airlines. The CDC recently released recommendations significantly curtailing mask requirements in both indoor and outdoor settings. And as one passenger said to me, I can go sit at a bar and drink for hours at a crowded bar now without wearing a mask, and yet I can't take a short flight from Bangor to Washington without wearing my mask, despite the fact that the airplane has a far better ventilation system than that crowded bar. And I thought it was a very good question. I understand that these decisions require an interagency process that includes the CDC, DHS, and DOT. But could you discuss the process for potentially lifting the mask mandate for air travel, provided that certain, I guess I'd like to know what are the benchmarks or metrics that you're going to use, given that the CDC has lifted it in other places?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your expression of support for flight attendants. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how seriously we take unruly behavior, and would add that with the zero tolerance policy, those who disrupt flight operations or harm or are disrespecting and violating laws and regulations face fines of up to $35,000. And we want to make sure that it is not felt that it's left to the flight attendants alone to enforce mask mandates or any other FAA regulation. As to the mask mandates on planes, like many of the traveling public, especially as I'm traveling more and more, I share the impatience to be able to return to where they're not required. As you mentioned, this is an interagency process. It's really driven by public health experts, and we do everything we can to run with that. They do point to some differences and uniqueness in the context of travel related to the number of people from different places passing through the same small space. The fact that a couple things would be different from the bar example, for example. One would be the presence of children on board, knowing that there's not yet a vaccine approved for children. Another, of course, is that if I'm not too sure about the person sitting next to me in the bar, I can get up and leave, and it's not the same in a moving aircraft. That being said, I do think that this is something that we need to continue to revisit. And while I haven't seen, to your question, a specific rubric that says if we hit this benchmark, then we can say goodbye to the masks, which I think we're all eager to do. I do think it's of course true that the sooner we get as many people as possible vaccinated, the sooner we can get there. And that's one of the reasons we're continuing to push on that.
Thank you. I have another mask-related question, which I'm going to submit for the record, but just to give you the outlines of it. I'm hearing from commercial vessel operators like barges and tugs from Portland Harbor that they find the guidance on masks to be very inconsistent and confusing. And apparently the Coast Guard has a lot of enforcement discretion. And these operators of the tugs and barges really don't want that kind of situation because they don't know what rules they're supposed to follow if the Coast Guard has discretion on enforcement. So I will provide you with further information, but would appreciate your getting back to me for the record on that. And finally, I just want to echo what the chairman said about the university transportation centers. I'm very proud of the work that's being done under Habib Dagher's leadership at the University of Maine. It's truly, absolutely extraordinary. And some of this is the use of sustainable, advanced manufacturing structures, construction methods, and it's resulted in real-world applications that extend the life of bridges in particular and reduce the carbon footprint of our transportation infrastructure projects. Just recently, I went to the dedication of a bridge in Herman, Maine, a short bridge that used all of these advanced materials. Instead of steel girders, it had composite girders. And the asphalt is such that it won't have to be jackhammered off when it needs to be replaced. It believe it or not, it's sort of screwed on. And so this is so innovative and so exciting. And this bridge is supposed to last for like 100 years because the new materials. But I share the chairman's concern that although the university's done a great job of trying to commercialize and get this material out into the marketplace, that it's hard to make that transition from the laboratory to the real-life application. I think the University of Maine's done a great job at it, but that's something that I think we really should look at, expanding the funding for the commercialization of those materials. So I just wanted to second what the chairman said and encourage you to take a look at that.
Well, I enthusiastically share your interest in that and would welcome chances to work together on it.
Great. Well, we'll have you up to the University of Maine at some point.
I'd love it.
Because it truly is extraordinary, the work that is being done there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Either right after or right before the University of Hawaii.
Actually, a Maine to Hawaii trip, you know.
That was pretty nice.
It can be arranged. Pick the right month. Secretary Buttigieg, I want to thank you for coming today to discuss the fiscal year 2022 budget request. The hearing record will remain open until Friday, June 25th, to allow members to submit additional questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.